The workshop before dawn held a stillness that felt almost solid, as if the darkness itself had weight. You would not have known the hour by looking outside, for the single window was still a square of deep blue-black, with no glimmer of morning yet touching the glass. The air inside was cool in a particular way, the coolness of a space that had rested all night without a fire, and it carried the faint, clean smell of tin. That smell was a dry, mineral scent, not sharp like iron, but softer, as if the metal itself had absorbed decades of quiet labor and was now exhaling it in the darkness. Beneath the tin there was a trace of old lamp oil, the kind that lingers around a wick even when no flame is present. And under that, the gentle, aged perfume of the pine boards that made up the walls and floor. When you stood just inside the door and let your breath fall into a slow rhythm, all these smells would settle around you like a thin, invisible blanket, and the world outside the workshop felt very far away. The workbench dominated the center of the room, a long, heavy table built from thick planks that had been smoothed by nothing more forceful than years of sliding metal and the brush of cotton sleeves. If you placed your palms flat on its surface, you would feel the shallow grooves worn by countless sheets of tinplate, and here and there, a faint, darkened spot where a hot soldering iron had once been set down a moment too long. The patina was not ugly, it was a record of time spent in patient making. A quiet document written in wood grain. Above the bench on the wall, a row of wooden pegs held the tools that gave this room its purpose. Mallets with cylindrical heads of rawhide and polished hickory hung in a neat line, each one showing the gentle darkening where hands had gripped it. Tin snips with long curved blades rested on two pegs side by side, their cutting edges oiled enough to catch a whisper of light. Further along, files of different shapes stood in a block, and a set of iron mandrels, slim and tapering, leaned in a corner like silent sentinels. None of these objects held any tension, they simply waited. In the far corner, a small pot-bellied stove sat on a square of brick, its iron surface cold and a little rough to the touch. The door was closed, the ash within long settled from the day before. Next to it, a covered clay pitcher of water and a shallow tin basin rested on a low stool. In this half-hour before dawn, you might feel the coolness of the water through the clay before you even dipped a finger into it. The floorboards, wide and slightly uneven, gave a soft creak only when stepped on, and even then it was a muffled sound, as if the wood itself meant to disturb nothing. The workshop at this hour was not a place of dreams exactly, nor of wakefulness, but something in between, a space suspended. The first movement was always the lighting of the lamp. In the dimness, your hand would find the small brass lamp on the corner of the bench, its reservoir filled with spumacity oil that had congealed slightly in the coolness, giving it a milky opacity. A flint and steel were kept in a little drawer, and the striking of them made a brief, bright sound, a tick-tick-tick followed by the catch of a spark on the charred cloth of the wick. The flame appeared not with a rush but with a modest rising, a small tongue of yellow that steadied itself into a teardrop shape. Its light pushed the shadows back into the corners, revealing the bench, the tools, the raw sheets of tin leaning against the wall like tall grey cards. The flame hardly flickered once it found its air, and that steadiness was the first gift of the day. After the lamp, your attention would turn to the water. Lifting the lid from the pitcher released a tiny chime of clay on clay, and the water you poured into the basin made a hollow, musical sound that deepened as the basin filled. Dipping both hands into it, you would feel the coolness wrap around your fingers and palms, a sensation that belonged entirely to the quiet of early waking. There was no soap with a strong scent, only a plain cake of hard white soap that smelled faintly of wood ash and fat. Washing took its own time. You would rub the soap between your hands, work up a thin, smooth lather, and then rinse it away, watching the water cloud just slightly before you dried your hands on a linen cloth that hung from a peg near the basin. That cloth was soft from many washings and many dryings, and it left your skin feeling cool and alert in a calm, unhurried way. With clean hands, you would begin the small ritual of laying out the tools for the day. The tinsmith did this, not from urgency, but from habit, the way leaves turn toward light. From a drawer beneath the bench you would lift a folded paper pattern, its edges softened by handling, and set it on the bench where the lamp's circle of light was brightest. Then came the wooden straightedge, A simple length of maple darkened along one edge from guiding the shears. A scratch awl with a bone handle was placed next to it, its point needle sharp but not threatening, just precise. The file card, a small flat brush with short wire bristles, came out and rested nearby. And finally the tin shears themselves, which you opened and closed once to make sure the pivot moved easily. The sound a smooth, metallic whisper. Each tool had a place, and finding that place was a kind of quiet thinking, a way of greeting the day without words. The window began to change. In the time it took to arrange these few simple things, the deep blue-black outside had softened to a dark grey, and a faint line of lighter grey traced the horizon beyond the glass. You might pause and notice how the lamp's reflection in the window had shifted from a bright point to a softer, ghosted shape, as the world outside slowly gathered its own light. There was no hurry to open the shutter. The lamp still gave more than enough illumination. The workshop in this mixed light was a place of gentle contrasts. The coolness of the tin sheets offset by the warmth of the wooden bench, the stillness of the heavy stove against the minute movements of the flame. The air had not yet warmed, but a kind of anticipation lived in it now. Not the anxious sort, just the sense that the day was arriving in its own good time. At last, you would move to the window and lift the iron latch, a small heavy thing with a curve that fit the thumb perfectly. The shutter, which was made of 2 wooden panels, swung outward without a creak because its hinges were kept oiled with a drop of the same spermaceti oil that fed the lamp. Opening it halfway let in a ribbon of cool, clean air that smelled of wet grass and distant wood smoke, the early morning scents of Connecticut in 1830. The sky was now a pale pearly grey, and across it a few high clouds caught the first hint of rose and gold that signaled the sun was somewhere below the rim of the hills. You could see the outline of the adjacent shed, the curve of the cart path, the dark shapes of bare elm branches, all perfectly still and silent. No bird had begun to sing. The world was in that breath-held moment before the full dawn chorus. Returning to the bench, you would stand for a while with your hands resting flat on the wood, palms down, fingertips spread slightly. This was not a pause born of indecision, but of readiness, the way a pond settles before a stone is dropped. The lamp flame, now sharing the room with the slow approach of day, cast a less dramatic light, and the colours in the workshop began to show themselves. The tinplate leaning against the wall had a dull, bluish-grey sheen, while the rawhide mallet heads were the colour of pale honey. The soldering iron, still mounted on its wooden handle in the rack, was a dark, sooty black at the tip, and the coils of thin solder wire in a wooden box looked like spun silver thread. You noticed these things not because they were new, but because your attention, freed from conversation and from any need to do anything quickly, could dwell on them one by one. The workshop had a particular order that spoke of a tinsmith who had worked here for many years. Scraps of tin were not scattered about, but collected in a low, wide basket under the bench, each piece sorted by size almost unconsciously. The floor, though not swept many times a day, held only the fine metallic dust that settled from cutting and filing, a dust that sparkled very faintly when the lamp tilted its light toward it. On a shelf above the tool rack, 3 completed Campbell molds sat wrapped in brown oiled paper, tied with cotton twine that crossed twice and was knotted with a neat, small bow. They were destined for a general goods merchant in Albany, who would in turn sell them to families outfitting wagons for the western settlements. In the quiet of early morning, they looked like 3 patient loaves of bread, waiting to be taken to a cart. The thought of the Westward families did not rush in with any loud sentiment. It was simply a fact, as calm as the wrapped molds themselves. As the grey light outside grew stronger, the lamp's oil level was checked with a little dip of a wire, and the wick was trimmed with a small pair of snips made just for that purpose. The trim bit of charred wick fell onto a small tin tray and was left there, still smoking for a second before the smoke dissolved. Then you would blow across the top of the lamp to extinguish the flame. A soft, round puff that left a thin, curling trail of white smoke that smelled briefly of paraffin and cotton before fading. The room was now lit entirely by the morning sky coming through the half-open shutter, a cool, diffuse light that made the shadows much softer and the details of the tools even clearer. You could see the faintest scratches on the steel of the shears, the worn label on a tin of flux paste. the tiny, almost invisible initials stamped into the handle of a hammer. The workshop felt fully awake now, though it had made no loud sound and no quick movement to get there. The temperature, too, had shifted. The coolness that greeted you at the door was giving way to a very gradual warmth that crept up from the floorboards as the earth outside absorbed the sun's first heat. The scent of tin was joined by the sweeter smell of the pine boards warming, and even the cold stove seemed to lose a degree of its chill. The air, which earlier had felt thin and still, now had the faintest movement, a circulation that entered through the window and left through the small gap under the door, carrying the fresh cut grass and distant wood smoke toward the back of the room, where it mingled with the metallic woody atmosphere and became simply the smell of the workshop in spring. You might take a moment to look out the window again, now that the world was fully visible. The sky was a clear, pale blue, and the elm branches were traced with tiny buds of green that would soon open into leaves. The cart path was empty, just two ruts of packed earth with a strip of grass growing in the middle. A small grey bird landed on a post near the shed, cocked its head twice, and flew off without a sound, leaving the post as empty as before. The landscape beyond was gentle and rolling, a patchwork of cleared fields and woodlots, with a few thin columns of chimney smoke rising straight up in the windless air. Nothing in that scene demanded anything of you. It was simply the state of things on a spring morning in a quiet corner of Connecticut, while inside a small workshop, a tinsmith stood ready to begin making a candle mold. The readiness was not a tense thing. It was more like a settled intention, present in the way the pattern lay on the bench. The shears waited with their blades half open, the straight edge was aligned with the table's edge. Every needed item was within reach, every surface was clear, and the only sound now was the very distant, muffled crow of a rooster somewhere far down the lane, so faint it was almost not a sound at all, but a memory of a sound. The workshop held you inside its calm order, and you felt your breathing slow and deepen, attuned to the pace of objects that did not hurry. The morning had arrived fully, and with it the first chapter of the day's work, the cutting of the tin sheet, which would begin not with a dramatic flourish, but with the simple, quiet act of picking up the pattern and aligning it with the metal, a motion so natural it hardly seemed like work at all, more like the continuation of a long, slow, unbroken thought. The flat sheet of tinplate that the tinsmith next lifted from the stack leaning against the wall was not shiny like silver, but carried a deeper, quieter grey, the colour of a still pond under an overcast sky. You would have felt its coolness first if you touched it, the metal seeming to draw the warmth from your fingers in a slow, steady way that was not unpleasant, but simply honest. The sheet was about as large as an open book, but thinner than a thumb, and it weighed less than you might expect, so that lifting it required no effort at all, only a careful, even grip on the edges. Its surface had a faintly mottled look, not from any flaw, but from the way the molten tin had once flowed over the iron plate in a distant rolling mill, cooling into subtle, crystalline patterns that caught the morning light now flowing through the half-open shutter. Those patterns were called spangles, and they would appear and disappear as you tilted the sheet, a delicate shimmer like frost on a window pane, fleeting and silent. The smell of the metal was clean and cool, a dry scent without sharpness, and it mingled with the honey-like aroma of the rawhide mallets hanging on the wall, and the faint, pleasant odour of pine resin that lived in the workshop timbers. In the 30 years since the first tinplate had been imported from mills in Great Britain, this particular sheet had journeyed a long way to reach a small Connecticut workshop. It had begun as iron ore smelted with charcoal in a Welsh furnace, then been rolled thin and dipped into a bath of liquid tin so hot it steamed and sighed, emerging coated on both sides with a protective skin that would resist rust for many years. After that, it had been packed in straw inside a wooden crate aboard a merchant schooner that sailed for weeks across the Atlantic, creaking through calm and gale alike, until it arrived at a New York wharf among crates of tea and bolts of cloth. A teamster had carted it up the river valley along rutted roads, finally delivering it to a hardware merchant who knew the tinsmith by name and set aside the best sheets for his regular customers. All that travel was now compressed into this one quiet rectangle resting on the workbench, and yet the tin itself held no memory of its passage. It was as blank and ready as a fresh page in a ledger, waiting for the pattern that would give it purpose. That pattern lay already on the bench, a sheet of heavy brown paper that had been made from old rags and pressed until it was smooth and crisp. It was not a factory-made thing, but something the tinsmith had drawn himself many months ago, using a straight edge and a sharp pencil and the measurements of a standard candle mold that had been popular with the Westwood families. The paper had softened along its fold lines from repeated handling, and at one corner a tiny smudge of tin dust marked it, a fingerprint of past labor. The lines on it were graphite grey and faint, yet perfectly clear. A large rectangle represented the main body, two narrow ones, the long sides, two smaller ones, the short sides, and a thin strip that would become the collar around the top. Inside the largest rectangle, 12 small circles were drawn in a neat grid, 3 across and 4 down, showing where the candle tubes would eventually stand. The pattern also indicated the allowance for seams, tiny tabs of metal that would be folded over to create a smooth, strong joint, and along one edge there was a note in careful, slanting script that read 12 candle mold, 1830. When you looked at that pattern, you did not see decoration or art. You saw pure, functional thought, the geometry of a useful object translated onto flat paper so that it could be multiplied many times. The tinsmith placed the pattern on the tin sheet with the same unhurried care that a cook uses to lay a pie crust into a dish. He aligned one long edge of the paper with the factory-cut edge of the metal, which was already straight and true, and then smoothed the paper down with the flat of his hand from the center outward, pressing out any invisible air until the pattern lay snug against the silvery grey surface. The small circles for the wick holders lined up perfectly parallel to the long edge, and the fold lines ran true with no wandering. This alignment was not a matter of chance, but of habit, a skill so deeply learned that the fingers found the correct position without the brain having to command them. The graphite lines on the paper now seemed to belong to the tin as much as the spangles did, a temporary marriage of intention and material, held together by nothing but gravity and the soft friction between paper fibers and smooth metal. For a long, quiet moment, the pattern sat there, and the workshop was utterly still, as if the room itself understood that a small but permanent transformation was about to commence. To transfer the pattern to the tin, a scratch awl was taken from the little leather cup that held it upright on the bench. The awl had a handle of oxbone, yellowed with age and polished by the oils of a human palm until it shone like old ivory, and the steel point was ground to a needle sharpness that could scribe a line as fine as a spider's thread. You would see the tinsmith hold the awl, not like a weapon but like a pen, between thumb and forefinger, with the remaining fingers curled gently beneath to guide the stroke. Starting at the top left corner of the pattern, he traced along the first graphite line with a steady, even pressure, and the point left behind a bright silver scratch in the tin's dull surface, a line that glinted when you tilted your head a certain way. The sound it made was a very soft, high hiss, like a summer insect heard through a closed window, continuous and without any harsh note. The line did not wander. It followed the paper's edge with a precision born of 1,000 repetitions, and when the awl reached the first corner, it paused, lifted, moved a fraction of an inch, and then began the next segment without breaking the rhythm. All the lines of the large body rectangle were scribed in this manner, and then the lines for the sides, and then the tiny crosses that marked the centers of the 12 circles where the wick tube holes would be punched later. Each scratch was identical in depth, because the hand never varied its pressure, and each one ran perfectly along the paper template, so that when the paper was at last lifted away, the tin sheet held a complete ghost image of the candle mold that was to be. The scribe lines were so faint that in some light angles they nearly disappeared, but from directly above they stood out as a delicate silver network, a map of future folds and cuts and solders inscribed on a metallic ground. No ink had been used, no charcoal powder rubbed into the lines, for the tinsmith's eye was trained to read those hairline marks in any light, and the slight burr thrown up by the awl point was enough to catch a fingernail and confirm the line's position by touch if needed. The whole act of scribing took a considerable time, not because it was difficult, but because it was thorough, each line receiving its due attention without haste. After the scribing, the paper pattern was folded once along its original crease and returned to the shallow drawer beneath the bench, where it would wait for the next mold in the batch. The drawer slid closed with a low wooden sound, and the workshop fell silent again except for the very distant rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker somewhere far off in the woods, a sound so soft and regular that it might have been the heartbeat of the morning itself. The tinsmith stood for a moment with both palms resting on the bench, looking at the scribed tin sheet with an expression that held no excitement or pride, only a calm assessment, the way a gardener looks at a row of seeds just tucked into the earth. What he saw was a set of rectangular boundaries, a few short lines for seam allowances, and 12 tiny cross marks arrayed in a grid. But behind that simple geometry stood an object already fully formed in his mind. A sturdy tin box with 12 smooth tubes inside, a hinged lid, and a wire catch, all destined to glide across a wagon's bed toward a cabin clearing where tallow would be rendered and candles drawn against the long prairie night. The tin sheet, now fully scribed, was moved to the center of the bench where the best light fell. The morning had advanced enough that the direct rays of the sun were beginning to slant through the window, drawing a warm golden parallelogram on the wood and catching a million tiny dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Within that patch of sunlight, the scribe lines on the tin became darker and more distinct, like canals of shadow, and the spangled grain of the tin plate revealed a subtle pattern of overlapping waves, frozen fluid metal made solid. It was in this light that the tinsmith took up the straight edge once more and checked each dimension against the marks on the bench rule that was tacked permanently along the front edge of the table. The rule, made of boxwood and incised with fine black lines and numbers, confirmed that the mold body would be exactly 9 inches long, 4 inches wide and 4.5 inches deep, dimensions that experience had shown to be right for a family's weekly candle making. A smaller family might need a 6-candle mold, but the 12 was the most requested, and so the pattern had been sized for that, and each measurement now matched without any discrepancy. There was a small particular about the seam allowances that deserved a moment's extra care. For the long sides to fold up and join cleanly with the short sides, a tiny notch had to be cut at each corner where the scribe lines intersected. The awl point was used to make these notches, not by scribing but by pressing just a little harder and then rocking the tool slightly, breaking the tin's edge in a controlled way that created a shallow, V-shaped indentation. You would watch this act and hear the faintest tick, a sound so brief it was over almost before you noticed it, and then the next corner received its notch, and the next, until all 8 corners of the main body and side panels had these tiny registration marks. They would serve as guides when the shears began their work, telling the hand where to stop the cut so that no metal was wasted and no join was left short. The notion of waste had no moral urgency here. It was simply a matter of economy, a habit formed by years of buying tinplate by the sheet and knowing the cost of every square inch. Off to one side of the bench, the tinsmith had earlier set out a small wooden block, a rectangular piece of maple, that was exactly the same width as the finished mold's interior. This was a forming block, a simple tool that would later be used to fold the tin sides around, keeping them square and true during assembly. It sat there patiently like a paperweight, its grain glowing a soft buttery color in the sunlight. Next to it was a tin of flux paste, its lid still tight, and a coil of solder wire that looked like thin silver spaghetti. These would not be needed until after the cutting and folding, but having them within reach was part of the tinsmith's way. The bench was a landscape of readiness, every item positioned so that the work could flow from cutting to folding to soldering, without a single wasted step or a moment's fumbling. The tin sheet, with its new silver scratch lines, lay at the center of this landscape, and it was now fully prepared, the pattern's language completely transferred. The tinsmith's hands, resting again on the bench edge, were calm and capable. They were not the hands of a young man, nor of an old one, but hands in their middle years, with skin toughened across the palms and fingertips from a life of handling metal edges, yet still sensitive enough to feel the difference between a burr and a smooth edge in total darkness. The nails were short and clean, the knuckles slightly enlarged from the constant gripping of tools, but the fingers were straight and moved with a fluidity that suggested patience more than strength. You might notice that the right thumb had a small white crescent scar, the relic of a slip with the shears many years ago, now faded to a faint line that the tinsmith never thought about. These hands were about to begin the cutting, but they did not hurry toward it. Instead, they lingered on the cool tin, tracing the lines one final time with a bare fingertip, confirming that each mark was true, each notch deep enough, each dimension correct. The fingertip traveled along the long rectangle, paused at each notch, then traced the smaller side rectangles, and finally circled the 12 tiny crosses in their tidy grid. A slow, soothing circuit that covered every inch of the planned mold. Outside, the morning had grown fully bright, and the sounds of the countryside had begun softly to fill the air. Somewhere a horse whinnied, far enough away that it was only a low, musical note on the breeze. A wagon creaked along the road beyond the field, its wheels making a periodic crunch on gravel that faded as it passed out of earshot. The birds had begun their calls, not the full chorus of dawn, but the steady, conversational chirps of sparrows and finches going about their day. These sounds entered the workshop through the open window like water seeping into sand, noticeable only if you paused to listen, and then fading back into the larger quiet that surrounded the bench. The light, too, had shifted from cool grey to a warm, buttery tone that painted the wallboards a deep honey and made the dust motes glitter like tiny flecks of gold leaf suspended in the still air. It was a beautiful morning in the plainest sense of the word, a morning that asked for nothing and promised nothing but the steady passage of hours. The tin sheet, now fully scribed and checked, was at last ready for the shears. The tinsmith lifted it with both hands, one at each side, and turned it so that the first cut line aligned with the edge of the bench, the metal overhanging by exactly the width of a finger. The shears were taken in the right hand, their curved blades catching the sunlight along the bevel, and the lower jaw was slipped beneath the tin, while the upper jaw rested precisely on the scribe line. There was a moment then, a full breath held suspended, when nothing moved and no sound was made. It was the quiet that precedes the first true note of a song, the pause between the striking of a clock's gears and the chime that follows. The tinsmith exhaled, and the blades began to close, their two halves coming together in a gentle, smooth convergence that would part the metal along the line. And the next chapter of the work, the chapter of cutting and trimming, was just about to begin. The first true sound of the day rose softly in the workshop as the tinsmith squeezed the handles of the tin shears together, bringing the curved blades into contact with the scribed line. It was not a sharp snap or a loud crunch, but a gentle, rolling snip, a sound that started near the hinge with a low creak and then traveled along the cutting edges as a crisp, high whisper, ending with a tiny metallic click when the blades had passed completely through the metal. In that sound you could hear the layers of the tinplate parting, the thin coat of tin on the surface giving way smoothly, while the iron heart beneath offered a mild, steady resistance that the shears overcame without strain. The motion of the cut was slow and deliberate, the kind of slow that makes you feel the shape of time itself bending, and when the blades finally separated again, the newly cut piece of tin lifted slightly off the bench, curling upward like a fresh wood shaving, its edge bright and silvery against the grey of the surrounding metal. That first cut was a short one, just a fraction of an inch long, freeing the seam allowance tab at one corner of what would become the bottom plate. The tinsmith paused with the shears still open in his hand, turned the tin sheet slightly on the bench, and then aligned the blades with the next segment of the scribe line. Again the handles came together, the metal divided with that same gentle rolling snip, and the corner tab was now connected to the main rectangle by only a single uncut line. It is worth describing the shears themselves, for they were a tool that had been with this tinsmith for more than a decade, their steel blades ground and sharpened many times until a faint hollow curve marked each bevel, and the iron handles were wrapped with a thin strip of leather where the fingers gripped, the leather darkened and polished from countless hours of use. The pivot, a heavy brass rivet, moved with a fluid smoothness that came from regular oiling, and when the blades were open, they formed a long, narrow V that seemed to wait patiently for the next piece of metal to enter its mouth. The weight of the shears in the hand was substantial but not tiring, and the balance was such that you could hold them in a loose grip and let the tool do most of the work, guiding it with the lightest pressure. Once the first corner tab was completely freed, the tinsmith set down the shears and used his thumb to rub lightly along the fresh edge, feeling for any tiny irregularities. The motion of the thumb was slow and circular, moving from one end of the cut to the other, and the skin, which was calloused enough to not be easily cut, detected a minute roughness, a line of almost invisible raised metal called a burr that the shears had left behind. Every cut in tinplate produces such a burr on the underside of the metal where the blade's edge pushes through, and if left unremoved, it could catch a finger later or prevent a clean solder joint from forming. So the tinsmith reached for the fine file that lay waiting on the bench, a slim rectangle of steel with tiny parallel teeth cut into its surface, set into a turned wooden handle that fit the palm perfectly. The file was drawn across the burred edge with a light, even stroke, and it made a sound so soft you might mistake it for the rustle of a sleeve against the bench. A whispered shh that lasted only a second and then stopped. 2 strokes, 3, and the burr was gone, the edge now smooth and cool to the touch, catching the sunlight as a clean, straight line of silver. With the first tab complete, the tinsmith returned to the shears and continued cutting along the scribed perimeter of the bottom plate. The shape was a rectangle about 9 inches long and 4 inches wide, with small square tabs extending from each corner and from the middles of the long sides, tabs that would later fold upward to form the base of the seam joints. Each cut was made in exactly the same way, the blades aligned, the slow squeeze, the soft rolling snip, the tiny curl of scrap metal falling away, and then the pause, the regrip, the next alignment. Between cuts, the tinsmith's breathing stayed calm and even, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes half-lidded, as if he were listening to music only he could hear. The work was repetitive, but not in a way that felt dull. It was repetitive the way waves are repetitive, each one similar, yet distinct, each one pulling you deeper into a quiet, rhythmic state where thoughts slow down and the world becomes only the metal, the blades, the light. As the bottom plate took shape, the tinsmith cut away the waste pieces that fell outside the scribe lines. These were not thrown carelessly aside but placed in the wide basket under the bench, each one lifted between 2 fingers and dropped with a soft clink as it landed among yesterday's clippings. The basket held a tangle of curved tin strips and tiny off-cut triangles, all of them catching the light in 100 different sparkles. A kind of accidental silver nest that would eventually be sold to a scrap merchant who visited twice a year. The act of placing each scrap into the basket was unhurried, and it gave a small, satisfying punctuation to each section of the cut, a moment of tidiness that kept the bench clear and the mind uncluttered. When the bottom plate was fully cut out and its edges filed smooth, it was set aside on a clean area of the bench, the first piece of the future candle mold to become a separate, tangible thing. The tinsmith then turned the remaining tin sheet and examined the scribe lines for the 2 long side pieces. These were rectangles of identical size, each one 9 inches long by 4.5 inches wide, with seam tabs along their bottom edges and along the 2 short ends. The long sides would form the front and back walls of the mold, and they needed to match each other exactly so that the assembled box would sit squarely on a shelf or a wagon bed. The scribe lines were checked against the bench rule one more time, and then the shears were lifted again. The lower blade slid under the tin, and the first long side began its separation from the sheet. The cuts for the long sides were longer than those for the bottom plate, and the sound of the shears changed when cutting a continuous line of 7 or 8 inches without stopping. It became a sustained, low hiss that began at the hinge and ran all the way to the blade tips, a steady shh that faded only when the tinsmith paused his squeeze to regrip the handles further down. Because tin plate is quite thin, perhaps only a 32nd of an inch, the blades did not need to be forced. They simply advanced through the metal like a slow knife through cold butter, parting it cleanly. The long strip of waste material that fell away from the first long side curled into an elegant spiral, and the tinsmith took a moment to admire the way it caught the sun, the spiral throwing a tiny dancing reflection onto the wall, a brief moving speck of light that darted across the wooden boards and vanished. Then the spiral was flattened by hand and dropped into the scrap basket with a faint, tinny chime. Filing the long edges of these side pieces took more strokes than the smaller tabs had, and the file's whispered song filled the workshop for a dozen slow breaths. The tinsmith held the side piece flat on the bench with one hand while drawing the file along its entire length with the other, the file moving in one direction only, not back and forth like a saw, but pushed away from the body with a smooth skating motion. At the end of each stroke, the file was lifted, returned to the starting point, and set down again, and a fine silver-grey dust drifted onto the bench, so fine that it looked like powdered frost. This dust was mostly iron, with a little tin, and it had a faint metallic scent that joined the other smells of the workshop, clean and not at all unpleasant. After every few strokes, the tinsmith would blow gently across the edge, his breath making a soft round puff that scattered the dust and revealed the bright, burr-free line beneath. And then he would test it with his thumb, nodding slightly at the smoothness. The two long sides were completed and placed next to the bottom plate on the bench, aligned parallel to each other with a small gap between them, so their edges would not accidentally knock together and create a new burr. The tinsmith's movements were naturally careful in this way, not from anxiety, but from a quiet respect for the material. Every piece of tin that went into the mold was a small investment of time, and a single scratch could mean starting a piece over, so the habits of care were deeply ingrained. The bench now held 3 flat shapes, and the large scribed sheet had shrunk noticeably, now containing only the rectangles for the 2 short sides, the strip for the top collar, and several smaller strips that would be rolled into the 12 candle tubes. The short sides were cut next, each one 4 inches wide by 4.5 inches tall, with seam tabs along 3 edges. Their cuts were shorter, and the snips came more quickly, though quickly is a relative term here, meaning there was less metal to separate, but no change in the pace of the work. The shears still closed with the same slow, rolling motion, the metal still parted with a gentle hiss, and each edge was still filed until it was perfectly smooth. The tinsmith's posture had not shifted, his shoulders were still relaxed, his breathing still even, his attention still absorbed entirely in the small rectangle of tin before him. If a thought strayed into his mind about the weather, or the price of solder, or the family who would someday pour tallow into this mold, it drifted out again without leaving a ripple, just as a cloud passes across the sun without dimming the day. Following the short sides came the top collar, a thin strip of tin about 1 inch wide and long enough to wrap around the entire upper rim of the mold, reinforcing it. This piece was not a simple rectangle but had 2 small tabs at each end that would overlap and form a neat joint. Cutting it required a few extra snips around those tabs, and the tinsmith used the very tip of the shears for these, nibbling away the waste with a series of tiny, precise bites that sounded like a mouse quietly working at a crust of bread. The tabs were small enough that the file had to be used with extra gentleness, held almost vertically, and drawn across the edge in short, delicate strokes that barely made any sound, more a faint sigh than a scrape. Now the large tin sheet was reduced to a series of narrow strips intended for the candle tubes. Each tube required a rectangular piece of tin about 1.5 inches wide and 4.5 inches long, so that when rolled into a cylinder around an iron mandrel, it would form a tube the exact depth of the mold and wide enough for a standard candle. 12 of these strips had to be cut, and the tinsmith approached this task with the same unvarying rhythm he had maintained all morning. He would align the shears with the first scribe line, make the cut, file the edge, place the strip on a growing pile, and then shift the sheet for the next cut. The repetition of it filled the workshop with a clockwork regularity, the snip and the pause, the snip and the pause, like a slow metallic breathing that could pull you down into a very deep and peaceful place if you let it. The pile of tube strips grew one by one, and the sunlight moved a fraction of an inch across the bench, and the birds outside sang a few notes and fell silent again, and none of these things felt separate from the cutting. They were all part of a single, unhurried flow. As each tube strip was cut, the tinsmith rubbed his thumb along its length to check for burrs, but he also checked for flatness, running his palm lightly over the surface to ensure no warps had crept in during the shearing. Tinplate can sometimes twist slightly when a long, narrow piece is cut, because the stresses locked into it during rolling are released unevenly. If a strip was found to have a slight curve, the tinsmith would lay it on the flat maple block and press it gently with the palm, then turn it over and press again, working out the curve with a patience that required no visible effort. The metal would relax under this treatment, returning to a true flat plane, and then it would join its siblings on the bench, perfectly ready for the rolling that would come much later. The final piece to be cut was a small tin disc that would become the wick holder plate, a thin circle about the size of a large coin with a tiny hole in its center. The scribe mark for this disc was faint, just a compass-drawn ring on a leftover corner of the sheet, and the shears were turned in a slow, sweeping curve to follow it, nibbling again and again with their tips, rotating the tin as the cut progressed until the little circle dropped free. The hole in its center would be punched later with a fine awl, but for now it was just a solid, silvery wafer that joined the other pieces on the bench. By the time this disc was filed and set down, the entire tin sheet had been transformed from a single blank rectangle into a neat arrangement of 15 separate parts: one bottom plate, 2 long sides, 2 short sides, 1 collar strip, 12 tube strips, and 1 wick holder disc. They lay on the wooden surface like the scattered pieces of a calm metallic puzzle, each one catching the light in its own quiet way. The whole array surrounded by the gentle dust of filing and the soft, steady warmth of a late morning sun. The workshop felt fuller now, not with noise or clutter, but with the presence of so many carefully prepared pieces. The air held the faint, pleasant tang of freshly cut metal, and the bench had a busy but ordered look, the parts spaced evenly, the tools resting in their assigned spots. The tinsmith took a long, slow breath and looked out the window for a moment, his eyes resting on the distant elm tree and the pale sky beyond, not because he was tired, but because the cutting was its own complete act, and it felt natural to pause before the next phase began. In the quiet that followed the last filing stroke, you could hear again the distant woodpecker tapping its tree, and closer, the soft rustle of a breeze stirring the grass just outside the window, and within the workshop, no sound at all but the almost imperceptible settling of the wooden floorboards under the sun's warmth. A tiny creak here and there that was not a disturbance but a part of the room's slow breathing, a marker of time passing with nothing to hurry it along. The soldering pot was an object of quiet importance in the workshop, a squat iron vessel that sat on a low hearth of brick beside the main bench. It was blackened by years of fire and oxide, its sides thick and heavy enough to hold heat long after the coals beneath had died to ash, and its rim had a small pouring lip that had been cast in one piece with the body, a subtle curve that guided the molten metal when it was time to empty the pot. Inside, the remains of yesterday's soda had cooled into a solid, pewter-colored mass, the surface wrinkled with the ghost of the last stir and speckled with faint rainbow hues from the tin and lead that mingled in its alloy. The morning light, now strong and slanting, touched the pot's rim and revealed a fine network of tiny cracks in the iron hairline paths that had no effect on the vessel's strength, but spoke of the many heating and cooling cycles it had endured. You would notice that the pot was never moved from its brick hearth. It was a permanent resident, as fixed as the bench or the window, and it contained within its dull black walls the memory of 10,000 seams soldered tight. The fire that would reawaken the solder pot lived first as a small, carefully arranged pile of charcoal in a brazier just outside the back door. The tinsmith kept the charcoal in a covered wooden bin, each lump salted from the ash and dust that settled at the bottom of the sack when it arrived from the charcoal burner's hut in the hills. The pieces he selected were about the size of a walnut, uniform enough to burn evenly, and they made a pleasant hollow clunk when they knocked together, a sound that was halfway between wood and stone. He carried 2 scoops of them in a small iron hod to the outside brazier, a shallow iron pan raised on 3 stubby legs, and then he added a nest of dried grass and the few thin splinters of pine kindling at the bottom. The flint and steel were taken from a pocket in his apron, and the spark was struck with a practiced, economical motion that produced just enough brightness to catch the kindling, which bloomed into a tiny orange flower of flame that quickly lost its color to become a transparent, shivering heat. The charcoal did not ignite with drama, but with a slow, patient catching, each lump beginning to glow at its edges, before the glow spread inward like the sunrise creeping across a field. The smoke that rose was blue-gray and thin, smelling of clean wood turned to carbon, and it drifted away on the morning air without leaving any stain. The tinsmith stood near the brazier as the fire established itself, occasionally using a small pair of tongs to nudge a lump into a better position. His movements unhurried, his face warmed by the gentle radiation. It took perhaps a full quarter of an hour for the charcoal to burn down to an even bed of glowing coals, each one a soft, pulsing orange that would hold its heat for a long, steady stretch of soldering work. When the coals were ready, they were transferred with the tongs into the small firebox beneath the soldering pot on the indoor brick hearth, one by one, each coal settling into a bed of yesterday's white ash, with a tiny puff of dust. The firebox had a small door that could be opened or closed to regulate the air, and the tinsmith set it just slightly ajar, enough to let in a slow, continuous breath of oxygen that fed the coals without causing them to flare. With the fire established, the soldering pot began its slow transformation. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The solid mass of old solder inside the pot retained its dull grey stillness, and the air above it did not shimmer. But deep in the iron wall of the pot, the heat from the coals was beginning to travel upward, molecule by molecule, a silent pilgrimage that had no visible sign. You could, if you held your palm a few inches above the pot, feel the faintest suggestion of warmth, a ghost of the fire's energy that was almost not there, but was definitely present, like a promise being kept. The tinsmith did not test for heat in this way, for he knew from long experience exactly how long the warming took. Instead, he spent the waiting time preparing the other soldering tools, allowing the pot to do its work undisturbed. The copper soldering iron was the tool that would deliver the heat to the seams, and it required its own preparation. Its handle was a smooth length of hickory, fitted over an iron rod that ended in a heavy copper head, the head shaped into a wedge with a fine point at the tip and a flat heel behind it. Copper was used because it held heat well and could be tinned easily, meaning a thin coating of solder adhered to its surface, allowing it to transfer the molten metal smoothly to the tin plate. The tinsmith took the iron from its rack and examined the tip in the light, turning it so the surface caught the sun. The old tinning was still intact, a thin silver layer that had oxidized slightly to a pale gold, and there were no pits or rough patches that would catch the flux or make the solder bead unevenly. Satisfied, he laid the iron across a small iron rest positioned near the firebox, its copper head extending into the edge of the burning coals, and left it there to heat up slowly alongside the pot. While both pot and iron were warming, the tinsmith opened the small tin of flux paste that sat on the bench. The lid unscrewed with a faint, gritty sound, and inside was a thick, honey-coloured substance that smelled strongly of pine resin, a sharp, clean, forest-like aroma that cut through the metallic air of the workshop. The flux was made from rosin, the same substance that violinists rubbed on their bows, boiled and mixed with a little tallow to give it body. Its purpose was to clean the metal surfaces when the heat was applied, dissolving the invisible oxide layer so the solder could flow and bond, rather than bead up and roll away. The tinsmith dipped a small, flat wooden spatula into the flux and transferred a dab, no bigger than a pea, onto a clean tin lid that served as a flux pallet. He then added a few drops of water from a tiny clay crute, stirring them together with the spatula until the consistency was like thin cream, a consistency that would brush easily onto the seams with a small bristle brush made from a hog's hair. The brush rested in a little notch on the pallet, and the whole assembly was placed at the back of the bench, ready but not needed just yet. Inside the soldering pot, the first sign of change appeared. At the very center of the solid solder mass, a tiny dimple formed, and then another, as if the surface were being gently pressed from below. The dimples grew and merged, and a thin, silvery liquid welled up, spreading outward in a perfect circle that pushed the solid chunks aside. The transformation from solid to liquid happened at a single temperature, a fixed point that the solder alloy reached all at once, and once the melting began, it progressed quickly and silently, the pool of liquid metal expanding until it filled the entire bottom of the pot. The surface of the molten solder was astonishingly bright, a mirror that reflected the rafters and the wall, and the lamp's hook with a slightly distorted rippling clarity, and it gave off no smoke or fume, only a thin, iridescent skin of oxide that formed instantly on contact with air and had to be stirred away. The tinsmith used a long, thin strip of seasoned hickory for this purpose, dipping it into the pot and stirring with a slow circular motion, the stick charring a little at the tip, but not burning because the solder's heat, while considerable, was far below the kindling point of wood. The stirring was a meditative act, the stick tracing the same circle again and again, the oxide skin swirling into grey wisps that dissolved back into the bright liquid. As he stirred, the tinsmith watched the copper soldering iron that lay in the coals. The tip of the iron was now glowing with a dull, dark red that was visible only in the shadowed corner of the firebox, a color that spoke of exactly the right temperature, not so hot that it would burn the flux or melt the tin plate, but hot enough to keep the solder liquid for the few seconds needed to run a seam. He lifted the iron from the coals with a gloved hand, tapped it gently against the iron rest to dislodge any clinging ash, and then touched the tip to a small scrap of tin that he kept for this purpose, a little offcut that was fluxed and waiting. A tiny drop of solder from the iron's tinning flowed onto the scrap and spread into a smooth, shining pool that set instantly into a firm, even coating. The test was perfect. The iron was ready. With the pot fully liquid and the iron at the right heat, the tinsmith set the iron back in its rest, keeping its tip just above the coals so it would maintain temperature, and turned his attention to the pieces of the candle mold that lay on the bench. The bottom plate and one of the long sides were the first to be joined, but before that could happen, the seam areas had to be fluxed. He picked up the small Hod's hair brush, dipped it into the thinned flux on the pallets, and painted a thin, even stripe along the tab of the bottom plate where the long side would attach, a stripe no wider than a pencil line. The flux went on transparent, slightly sticky, and it glistened in the light like a trail left by a snail on a dewy morning. Then he painted a matching stripe along the bottom edge of the long side piece and set both pieces down with their fluxed edges upward, letting the rosin dry just a little while he prepared the solder wire. The solder wire was a thin, solid strand about as thick as a darning needle, coiled into a loose loop that rested in a shallow wooden box. It was made from the same alloy as the pot solder, a mixture of tin and lead that melted at a relatively low temperature and flowed easily into the tight gap of a well-fitted tin plate seam. The tinsmith uncoiled a short length, snipped it off with the shears, and held it between thumb and forefinger, the wire cool and slightly soft, bending easily under the lightest pressure. He then lifted the copper soldering iron from its rest, the handle now warm but not hot through the wooden grip, and carried it to the bench where the prepared pieces waited. The iron's copper tip glowed faintly, and a plume of heat shimmered above it, making the air waver like a mirage over a summer road. Everything was ready now. The heat and the metal and the flux and the wire and the workshop settled into a deep, anticipatory quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives just before a careful pair of hands begins to join two pieces of tin into something that will last for many years. The first seam was made not with haste, but with a gathering of attention so complete that the workshop seemed to contract around the two small pieces of tin lying on the bench. The tinsmith lifted the bottom plate in his left hand. His thumb pressed flat along its flux tab and brought the long side piece into position with his right, the two edges meeting at a perfect right angle, flux stripe to flux stripe, held together by the light, steady pressure of his fingers, as if the metal itself understood what was required and consented to remain still. A small wooden jig, no more than a block of maple with two faces planed exactly square, had been placed on the bench beforehand, and the joined pieces were slid against it, the bottom plate resting flat while the long side stood vertical, braced by the block so that the angle would not shift when the soldering iron arrived with its liquid heat. The jig had been used for hundreds of such seams, and its surfaces were marked here and there with faint scorch marks, tiny caramel-colored streaks where a too-hot iron had once kissed the wood, but it remained true and square, as reliable as the sunrise. The copper soldering iron was lifted from its rest, the handle warm in the tinsmith's palm, the tip trailing a ghost of heat shimmer that wiggled the air. He touched the tip briefly to a small block of sal ammoniac kept in a dish near the flux, a white, crystalline mineral that fizzed and smoked on contact, cleaning the copper of any residual oxide and leaving the tined surface bright and silver. A tiny wisp of acrid ammonia-scented vapor rose and drifted away, and then the iron was carried in a straight, calm line to the waiting scene. In the tinsmith's other hand, the short length of solder wire was pinched between thumb and forefinger, held perhaps an inch above the junction of the two tin pieces. The moment before the solder flowed was always a held breath, a poised stillness that contained within it the memory of every failed joint and every successful one, the knowledge that heat must be just enough and no more, that the solder must enter the seam and not merely sit on top. The tip of the iron touched the outer surface of the long side, right at the base where it met the tab, and the heat poured through the thin tin plate in a sudden, invisible wave. The flux, which had dried to a faintly sticky film, liquefied instantly with a soft sizzle that was more a sensation than a sound. A tiny, rapid bubbling as the rosin melted and spread, scrubbing the oxide from the metal as it went. A thin curl of white smoke rose from the seam, smelling strongly of pine forests, clean and sharp, and then the solder wire was brought down and pressed gently into the corner where the two pieces met. The heat from the iron traveled through the tin and into the wire, and the wire did not melt all at once, but softened first, drooping slightly, then turned bright and liquid. A silver droplet that seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second before it was drawn into the seam by an invisible pull. The pull was called capillary action, a quiet, patient force that wickered the molten solder into the microscopic gap between the two tin surfaces, filling every tiny valley and crevice until it reached the other side, where it emerged as a neat silver line, perfectly parallel to the edge. The tinsmith drew the iron slowly along the seam, and the soda followed it, not rushing but flowing in a smooth, continuous wave that advanced at the pace of a crawling snail. The iron's tip left behind a trail of mirror-bright liquid that lost its gloss within a heartbeat as the solder cooled and solidified, changing from liquid silver to a matte grey that exactly matched the surrounding tin. The speed of the drawing was learned over decades. Too fast and the solder would not penetrate the seam, leaving a weak joint that might crack open later under the weight of hot tallow. Too slow and the heat would build up until the tin plate itself began to warp, pulling the seam apart before it could set. The correct speed was the speed of a calm breath, steady and even, and the tinsmith moved with a rhythm that felt almost musical, a slow, legato motion that had no hurry and no hesitation. When he reached the end of the seam, the iron was lifted smoothly, the last tiny droplet of solder falling back onto the pallet, and the seam was left to cool in the still air. A seam just soldered needed a moment of stillness before being moved. The metal was hot, but more importantly, the solder was in a critical state between liquid and solid, a brief phase during which the crystalline structure of the alloy was forming itself, tin atoms and lead atoms arranging into a stable lattice that would determine the joint's strength for the rest of its life. If the pieces were shifted during this phase, the solder could develop a hairline crack, invisible to the eye, but fatal to the seal. So the tinsmith waited, counting heartbeats, while the seam gave up its heat to the surrounding air. You could see the color of the solder shift from bright silver through a duller gray to the final settled pewter tone, and as it cooled, it contracted just slightly, pulling the two pieces of tin even tighter together, a microscopic clenching that made the joint stronger than the metal around it. A wisp of flux residue, now dark brown and brittle, clung to the edge of the seam, and the tinsmith brushed it away with a corner of the rag that hung from his apron, the residue flaking off like a dried leaf, and falling off the bench where it lay among the tin dust. The first seam was complete, and the bottom plate was now permanently attached to one long side, the two pieces forming an L shape that could be stood on its edge like a book opened partway. The tinsmith lifted the assembly and held it to the light, sighting along the seam to confirm it was straight and full, with no gaps or thin spots. The line of solder was a continuous, even ribbon, slightly raised in the center, and on the inside of the joint a mirror line had formed, exactly parallel, proving that the solder had penetrated all the way through. Satisfied, he set the assembly back against the jig and reached for the second long side, which was already fluxed along its bottom tab and waiting on the bench. The process repeated, not identically, but with the same sequence of motions, the same careful alignment against the wooden block, the same cleansing dab on the sal ammoniac, the same soft sizzle of flux, and the same pine-scented smoke. Each seam was a small universe of repetition, yet within that repetition there were subtle variations, the exact angle of the iron, the length of solder wire fed into the joint, the faintly different pattern of the smoke as it rose and twisted. The mind that watched this work did not need to count how many seams remained, it simply settled into the rhythm, and the rhythm became a form of rest. The second long side was joined to the bottom plate's opposite edge, and now the assembly was a U-shaped channel, the bottom plate flat on the bench, and the two long sides rising vertically, parallel to each other like the walls of a tiny tin canyon. The structure was still quite flexible. Tin plate this thin would bend under finger pressure, and the long sides wobbled slightly if you touched their top edges. That wobble would disappear once the short sides were solid in, turning the four walls into a rigid box that could be handled without distortion. But before that, The tinsmith checked the squareness of the two long sides by placing the maple-forming block inside the channel. The block, which was exactly the interior width of the finished mold, slicked in with a gentle friction, its flat sides pressing evenly against the tin walls and straightening out any minor curves that the cutting and soldering might have introduced. The block stayed in place for the next stage, serving both as a brace and as a reference surface that would keep the short sides aligned correctly. Now came the short sides, the two pieces that would close the ends of the box. They were smaller than the long sides, 4 inches wide, and their seam tabs were folded slightly differently, with the tabs on the long edges rather than the bottom. The tinsmith applied fresh flux to all the contact areas, the vertical tabs on the short sides, the inner faces of the long sides near the ends, and the bottom plate tabs that would fold upward to meet the short sides. The flux brush moved in small, tidy strokes, leaving a faintly glossy trail that would soon vanish into smoke. The first short side was positioned against the open end of the U-channel, its bottom edge seated squarely on the bottom plate, its side tabs pressing against the inner faces of the long walls. The maple block, still inside, held the long walls apart at the correct distance, so the short side fit exactly, with no need for trimming or forcing. The tinsmith held it in place with the fingers of his left hand, his thumb bridging the corner, while the rest of his hand steadied the assembly from outside. The iron, still hot, was taken up again, and the first vertical seam was run up the corner, the solder flowing downward with gravity's gentle pull, a silver trickle that filled the joint from bottom to top. The smoke from this flux was a little thicker, because the joint was vertical, and it curled upward in a lazy spiral, catching the window light and turning momentarily golden before dissipating. When that seam was cool, the opposite vertical seam on the same short side was soldered, and then the tiny horizontal seam along the bottom where the short side met the upward folded tab of the bottom plate, a much shorter run that took only a breath to complete. The second short side was attached in the same manner, and as each seam cooled and hardened, the box became progressively more solid, the tin plate losing its flexibility as the interconnected joints created a unified structure. By the time all 4 walls were soldered to the bottom plate and to each other, the candle mold body was a true rigid rectangle, open at the top, its walls straight and its corners square, and its seams a network of fine silver-grey lines that traced the edges like a careful drawing. The tinsmith turned the box over in his hands, examining every seam from both sides, his thumb running along each soldered line to feel for any irregularity, a bump or a pit, that might indicate an incomplete fill. There were none. The maple-forming block, which had been locked inside the box by the completed walls, was slid out with a gentle tug, and it came free cleanly, leaving the interior of the mold perfectly smooth and ready for the installation of the candle tubes later. The block was set back on its spot on the bench, to wait for the next mold in the batch. Before moving on, the tinsmith took up a small rawhide mallet, the one with the pale honey-coloured head and the hickory handle worn dark with use. Even though the box was square, the process of heating and cooling could sometimes introduce a tiny amount of warp, a wall that leaned inward by a fraction of a degree, and the mallet was the tool for correcting this. He set the box on the flat maple block and tapped gently along the top edges of the 4 walls, the mallets making a soft, dull thud that was more felt than heard, a percussive whisper that nudged the metal by imperceptible amounts. After each tap he would sight along the wall to check its straightness, then tap again, the strokes so light they would not have disturbed a sleeping cat. The tinplate responded willingly, its malleable nature allowing these tiny adjustments without complaint, and in a few moments the box was as square as geometry could make it. The flux residue that remained on the seams was now cleaned away with a soft rag dipped in the basin of water. The tinsmith wrung out the rag until it was merely damp, not wet, and wiped each seam with a slow circular motion, the damp cloth cooling the metal and dissolving the brittle brown rosin residue. The water in the basin, which had been clear and cool at dawn, was now faintly cloudy with tin dust and rosin particles, but it still served, and the seams, once wiped, showed their true color, a clean silver grey that blended almost invisibly with the tin plate, making the joints appear as natural as the grain in wood. The rag was rinsed and draped over the rim of the basin to dry, and the candle mold body, now complete and clean, was placed at the center of the bench, waiting for its interior tubes. The sun had moved a noticeable distance across the workshop floor during the soldering of the seams, the patch of light now touching the leg of the bench and illuminating the dust motes that floated in the still air. The warmth of the day had begun to build, not unpleasantly, just a gradual deepening of the temperature that made the smell of the pine boards a little stronger and caused the metal tools to lose their early morning chill. Outside, the birds had quieted to occasional chirps, the height of their song having passed, and in the distance a cow lowed once, a long musical note that hung in the air and then dissolved. The workshop held the quiet of midday approaching, a different quiet from the pre-dawn stillness, more settled and grounded, filled with the presence of work that was half done and the promise of work still to come. The Campbell mold body, standing open-topped on the bench, was a tangible marker of the morning's slow, careful progress, and it waited with the patience of all well-made things for the next step. The rolling and fitting of the 12 candle tubes that would turn this simple box into a tool for making light. The 12 flat strips of tin that had been cut from the larger sheet now lay in a neat stack on the bench, each one a slender rectangle waiting to become a hollow cylinder. They were identical in width and length, yet each had its own subtle character. If you looked closely, one had a faint spangle mark near its edge, another a barely perceptible curve from the way it had rested in the stack, a third a tiny dark speck where the tin coating was slightly thinner. These small differences would vanish as the strips were rolled and soldered into tubes, subsumed into a uniformity that was the hallmark of good craft. The tinsmith lifted the top strip from the pile and held it between thumb and forefinger, turning it in the light to confirm its flatness, and then he set it down on the cleanest part of the bench, the area where the maple block had been, now wiped free of dust and ready for the delicate work of rolling. The tool that would shape these strips into tubes was an iron mandrel, a polished rod about the thickness of a man's little finger and slightly longer than the strips themselves. It rested in a rack on the wall alongside several others of different diameters, each one used for making different sizes of tubes, from the narrow spouts of oil cans to the wide barrels of stovepipes. This particular mandrel had been turned on a lathe by a blacksmith years ago, and its surface was a deep, lustrous grey from countless passes of tin plate, burnished to a slickness that felt almost oily under the thumb, though it carried no oil at all. The tinsmith took it down from its pegs and wiped it once with a soft cloth, not because it needed cleaning, but because the act of wiping was a small ritual of readiness, a way of greeting the tool before the work began. The mandrel was cool when it first touched the hand, and its weight was satisfying in the way that all well-made iron objects are satisfying, a compact density that promised precision. The first strip of tin was laid across the bench so that its long edge faced the tinsmith. He positioned a mandrel along one of the strip's short edges, aligning it perfectly parallel with the edge and leaving a tiny overhang, about the width of a fingernail, where the tin would wrap around and close the cylinder. The overhang was the seam allowance, the same principle as the tabs on the mold body, and it would form the overlap where the solder would flow and seal the tube. With the mandrel held steady in his left hand, the tinsmith used the fingers of his right hand to lift the free edge of the tin and fold it over the iron rod, pressing it down along the entire length so that the metal accepted the curve. The tin did not resist. It was thin enough to bend easily under finger pressure, and it made a soft, whispery sound as it rapped, a sound like a page being turned in a book, very slowly, or like a fallen leaf sliding across a stone. Once the tin had been given its initial curve, the tinsmith reached for the rawhide mallet, the same one he had used to true the mold body. The mallet's head was cylindrical and slightly yielding, hard enough to shape metal, but soft enough to leave no marks, and it was this tool that would coax the tin strip into a perfect, tight cylinder around the mandrel. The tinsmith began tapping along the length of the wrapped strip, starting at one end and moving slowly toward the other, the mallet rising and falling with a gentle, even pulse that made a series of soft thuds, each thud identical to the last. The sound was muffled and low, absorbed partly by the rawhide and partly by the tin, and it did not echo but died almost instantly into the workshop's quiet air. Under these patient taps, the tin gradually tightened around the iron, its springy nature being slowly overcome, the metal learning its new shape, one tap at a time. The tinsmith rotated the mandrel slightly between taps, ensuring that the pressure was distributed evenly around the circumference, and the tube became rounder and tighter with each pass of the mallet. When the tube was fully wrapped and its seam overlap lay flat against the mandrel, the tinsmith lifted the whole assembly to his eye and sighted along its length, checking that the cylinder was straight and that the overlap was even from end to end. The tin now formed a tube that was exactly 4.5 inches long, matching the depth of the mold box, and its diameter would produce a candle of standard thickness, the kind that would burn for several hours in a settler's lantern or on a cabin mantel. The seam that needed soldering was a fine, straight line along the length of the tube, and it was here that the next careful steps would be taken. The same flux and solder sequence that had joined the mold body, now miniaturized onto a smaller canvas. The soldering pot on its brick hearth had been kept at temperature throughout the morning, the coals occasionally freshened with a new lump of charcoal, and the molten solder inside still shimmered with its mirror-bright surface. The copper iron had been returned to its rest and was still hot, its tip glowing with that same dull red that marked the correct heat. The tinsmith brought the wrapped mandrel to the bench, laid it down carefully with the seam facing upward, and took up the flux brush once more. The seam was painted with a thin line of the thinned rosin paste, the brush moving in a single, uninterrupted stroke from one end of the tube to the other, leaving a trail that glistened for a moment before drying to a faint tackiness. A short length of solder wire was uncoiled and snipped, even thinner than the wire used for the box seams, because the tube's joint was smaller and needed less material to fill it. The wire was laid alongside the fluxed seam, and the iron was lifted from its rest, its tip refreshed on the sour ammoniac block with a small hiss of white vapor. The soldering of a tube seam was a quicker operation than the box seams, but it was no less careful. The tinsmith touched the hot iron to one end of the seam, the flux sizzled, the pine smoke curled upward in a thin thread, and the solder wire was brought to the joint, melting instantly and wicking into the overlap. The iron was drawn along the seam in a single smooth pass, and the solder followed it like a silver shadow, filling the joint and then cooling within seconds to a matte grey line. The whole process took perhaps 4 slow breaths from start to finish, and when it was done, the tube was permanently sealed, a hollow cylinder of tin that could hold hot tallow or beeswax without leaking a single drop. The seam was wiped with the damp rag while it was still warm, removing the flux residue before it could harden and become difficult to clean, and the tube was allowed to cool fully before the mandrel was extracted. Removing the mandrel required a particular technique. If you simply pulled it straight out, the friction might cause the tin to stretch or the seam to tear, so the tinsmith gripped the mandrel with one hand and the tube with the other, and he twisted them in opposite directions while pulling gently apart, a slow, rotating separation that broke the friction gradually. The mandrel slid free with a soft, smooth sensation, and the tube remained in the tinsmith's hand, its interior now hollow and clean, its seam a nearly invisible line, its shape perfectly cylindrical. The mandrel was set aside on the bench, still warm from the soldering heat, and the finished tube was placed on a clean area of the bench where the other completed tubes would soon join it. The first of 12 was done. The process repeated for the second strip, and then the third. Each repetition was a small journey through the same landscape. The positioning of the mandrel, the folding of the tin, the tapping with the mallet to tighten the wrap, the fluxing of the seam, the touch of the iron, the flow of the solder, the wipe of the rag, the twist to free the mandrel. Yet within this repetition, there was a quiet evolution. The hands grew incrementally more efficient, the mallet strokes became even more rhythmic, the soldering passes even more fluid. The tinsmith did not count the tubes aloud, nor did he seem to need to. The growing row of finished cylinders on the bench was its own tally, a visible record of progress that the eye could check in an instant. After the 6th tube, he paused to refresh the coals in the firebox, adding 3 fresh lumps of charcoal with the tongs and adjusting the air door to keep the heat steady. And then he returned to the bench and took up the 7th strip without any sense of interruption. The second half of the 12 tubes was made in the same unhurried way, the morning light now full and golden through the window, the workshop warm but not hot, the air rich with the alternating scents of pine flux and cooling tin. By the time the 12th tube is soldered, cleaned, and freed from the mandrel, the row of finished cylinders on the bench looked like a tiny pipe organ, each tube the same length and diameter, each seam aligned in the same direction, each surface carrying the same soft grey luster of freshly worked tin plate. They were a quiet monument to the power of doing one thing many times, of letting the hands learn a rhythm so deeply that the mind could rest while the body worked. The tinsmith looked at the row with the same calm assessment he had given the scribe's tin sheet hours ago, and he nodded once, a small private gesture of satisfaction that no one else would have seen. The tubes were now complete, but a candle tube was not functional without a wick holder at its base. The wick holder was that small tin disc, about the size of a large button, with a tiny hole in its center through which the cotton wicking would be threaded by the settler who eventually used the mold. The tinsmith had cut these discs in a batch of 12 during the earlier cutting stage, and they now waited in a small tin tray at the back of the bench, each one a flat silver circle, waiting for its hole. The hole was made with a fine awl, smaller than the scribing awl, its point ground to a needle's sharpness. The tinsmith took up one disc and placed it on the end grain of the maple block, where the wood fibers were vertical and would resist the awl's point without splintering. He positioned the awl tip at the exact center of the disc, pressed down with a steady, even force, and rotated the awl between his fingers while pushing, a drilling motion that cut a clean, round hole rather than tearing a ragged puncture. The tin gave way with a tiny, crisp pop, and the hole was made, perfectly centered and perfectly round, just wide enough for a cotton wick to pass through with a snug fit. With the hole drilled, the wick holder disc was ready to be soldered to the base of its tube. The tinsmith took one of the completed tubes and one of the drilled discs, and he fluxed the bottom rim of the tube as well as the outer edge of the disc. The disc was placed flat on the heat-resistant brick beside the soldering pot, flux side up, and the tube was stood vertically on top of it, centered so that the disc's edge extended just slightly beyond the tube's wall all the way around. Holding the tube steady with a pair of long-nosed pliers that had wooden grips on their handles to keep heat from traveling to the hand, the tinsmith touched the hot iron to the junction where tube met disc. The soda, already clinging to the iron's tip from a quick dip in the pot, flowed into the joint in a neat circular bead, wetting both surfaces and forming a strong, leak-proof seal. The operation was repeated for the remaining 11 tubes, each one receiving its disc in turn, and when it was done, the 12 tubes were truly finished, each one a sealed candle mold in miniature, able to contain liquid wax or tallow and to support a wick standing straight up its center. The row of completed tubes was moved to the side of the bench, and the tinsmith took a moment to clean his tools. The soldering iron was set back in its rest to maintain heat, but the flux brush was rinsed in a small cup of turpentine that lived under the bench. Its bristles worked gently against the cup's side to dissolve the sticky rosin residue, then laid flat on a clean rag to dry. The sal ammoniac block was scraped with the edge of a tin scrap to remove the charred flux that had built up, revealing fresh white crystals beneath. The mandrel was wiped with an oily cloth to prevent rust, though the burnishing from the tin had already made it quite resistant, and it was returned to its pegs on the wall. The mallet was hung back on its hook, the shears were closed and laid flat, and the bench was swept with a small, short-bristled brush. The tin dust and flux flakes collected into a pile and tipped into the scrap basket. The workshop was returning to its state of calm order, the tools resting in their places, the materials neatly stacked, the air slowly clearing of smoke and settling once more into the quiet, metallic, piney atmosphere that had greeted the dawn. Outside, the day had moved into early afternoon without any announcement beyond the shifting of the shadows. The light through the window was still bright, but had lost its morning sharpness, becoming a softer, more golden illumination that made the wooden walls glow and the 10 pieces gleam with a gentle warmth. The small breeze had risen, and it drifted through the window from time to time, stirring the air and carrying the scent of fresh grass and the distant earthy aroma of turned soil from a field being ploughed somewhere beyond the elms. The tinsmith stood by the window for a moment, his hands resting on the sill, his eyes tracking the slow movement of a cloud across the pale blue sky, and then he turned back to the bench where the 12 candle tubes stood in their neat row, standing upright on their new wick holder bases like a miniature silver forest, waiting to be installed into the mold body that stood open-top beside them, ready for the next slow, patient step of assembly. The mold body stood on the bench, its 4 tin walls rising from the bottom plate to form an open rectangular box, and beside it lay the 12 completed candle tubes, each one a slender cylinder capped at its lower end with a tiny wick-holder disc. The morning had long since deepened into a warm and steady afternoon, and the light coming through the window had lost its sharp, angled clarity, softening into a golden haze that wrapped the workshop in a drowsy, comfortable glow. The air, still faintly scented with pine rosin and the cool breath of tin, felt heavy with the quiet accumulation of hours, and the only sounds were the distant, intermittent crow of a rooster and the gentle creak of a floorboard settling somewhere in the building's frame. The tinsmith had taken a moment to drink a dipper of water from the clay pitcher, the water cool and tasting faintly of the earthenware, and now he stood at the bench with his hands resting easily on the wood, surveying the parts that would soon become a single unified tool for making light. The next piece to enter the assembly was the interior tray, a thin sheet of tin that had been cut and punched on a previous day, part of a small stack of such trays kept ready for the batch of molds. The tray was a rectangle that matched the interior footprint of the mold body exactly, so that it would slide in with a close, even fit against all 4 walls, and its surface was pierced with 12 round holes, arranged in a tidy grid of 3 across and 4 down. Each hole was just large enough to admit one of the candle tubes, with a slight friction, and the edges of the holes had been filed smooth so that no sharp burr would scratch the tube or catch a finger. The tinsmith lifted one of these trays from the stack, holding it up to the light to confirm that the holes were clean and the tin was flat, and then he set it on the bench beside the mold body, its dull silver surface catching the afternoon sun in a brief, soft flash. The first step in fitting the tubes was to place them upright inside the mold body, one by one, like setting stalks into a garden bed. The tinsmith lifted the first tube between thumb and forefinger, feeling its lightness and the smoothness of its soldered seam, and lowered it into the box until its wick-holder base rested flat on the bottom plate. The tube stood on its own, held vertical by the disc at its foot, though it wobbled slightly if touched because the upper part had nothing to brace against. The second tube was placed beside the first, aligned in the same row, and the tinsmith used a wooden straightedge to ensure they were exactly parallel and evenly spaced, tapping each base gently with the tip of a finger until the gap between them matched the spacing of the holes in the tray. The third tube completed the first row, and then the tinsmith worked back along the next row, his movements as deliberate as those of a chess player setting pieces on a board, though the game here was one of perfect alignment rather than strategy. As each tube was added, the interior of the mold began to resemble a tiny silver copse, the tubes rising from the bottom like slender trunks waiting for a canopy. The tinsmith adjusted the spacing of each row with the straight edge, nudging a base a fraction of an inch left or right, and he checked the squareness of the whole array by sighting down the length of the box from one end. The tubes, still unsecured, made a faint, glassy clinking when they touched each other, a sound like distant wind chimes, and he was careful to keep them just slightly apart so that no metal would scratch metal. By the time all 12 were standing, the mold body held a neat, orderly grid of hollow columns, their grey surfaces softly gleaming, their open tops waiting to receive the tray that would lock them into permanence. Now the tinsmith took up the tray and held it above the box, aligning its outer edges with the walls. The 12 holes in the tray had to meet the 12 tubes simultaneously, and this required a slow, careful descent. The tray lowered a fraction of an inch at a time, while the tinsmith watched the nearest holes begin to encircle their tubes. The fit was close, and the first contact came as a gentle resistance where the tube rims brushed the edges of the holes. Rather than force the tray down, the tinsmith wiggled it slightly, a barely perceptible rocking motion that allowed each tube to find its opening, and then the tray slid downward smoothly, the tubes passing through the holes with a soft, uniform friction that made a sound like a silken whisper. When the tray had been pressed down to the proper depth, about an inch below the upper rim of the mold body, the 12 tubes stood perfectly vertical, held in precise alignment by the tray above and the bottom plate below, their bases still resting freely on the floor of the box. The tray now looked like a flat silver ceiling, with 12 chimney tops projecting through it, and the whole assembly had the quiet, pleasing order of a well-planted orchard seen from above. Before any solder could be applied, the tinsmith needed to be certain that the tray was level and that its edges made a continuous, even contact with the inner walls of the mold body all the way around. He took up a small wooden wedge, a thin slip of maple tapering to a knife edge, and ran it along the perimeter of the tray where it met the walls, checking for gaps. In one corner, the gap was a little wider, perhaps the thickness of a sheet of paper, and he remedied this by pressing down gently on that corner of the tray with the flat of his thumb, while simultaneously lifting the adjacent wall outward by a hair, using the natural springiness of the tin. The adjustment was so small that the eye could not see it, but the feel of the wedge told him when the fit was true. Satisfied, he removed the wedge and let the metal relax into its new position. The tray now seated evenly on all sides. The soldering of the tray to the mold body was a delicate operation, more delicate than any of the seams that had come before, because the heat required to flow the solder could easily warp the thin tin tray or loosen the already soldered seams of the box if applied too heavily or too long. The tinsmith's solution was to work in short, separated stitches, soldering only a tiny section of the tray's edge at one time and then pausing to let the heat dissipate completely before moving to the next. He prepared his tools with the same calm routine as before. The flux was thinned to a milky consistency. The soldering iron was cleaned on the sal ammoniac block until its copper tip shone silver. The solder wire was clipped into half-inch lengths that could be fed precisely into each joint. The fire in the brazier had been adjusted so that the iron's heat was steady but not fierce, a deep, muted red that was just enough to melt the solder without scorching the tin. The first joint was made at the midpoint of one long wall, where the tray's edge met the inside face of the mold body. The tinsmith dipped a fine, pointed flux brush into the thinned rosin and touched it to the tiny seam, leaving a dot of amber liquid that immediately sank into the crevice. He then picked up the soldering iron in one hand and a snippet of solder wire in the other, and he brought the iron's tip to the junction, holding it there for the space of a single slow breath. The flux sizzled, its piney smoke curling upward in a thread so thin it was nearly invisible, and the solder wire was touched to the hot metal, where it melted into a bright, quivering bead that swept into the joint through capillary action. The iron was withdrawn, and the bead cooled within seconds, turning from liquid mirror to solid matte grey. The tinsmith waited, counting heartbeats, until the metal had given up its heat to the surrounding air and to his own patient stillness, and then he moved the iron to a point 2 inches further along the same wall, repeating the stitch with another tiny bead of solder. He progressed this way around all 4 walls, placing a soldered stitch every 2 or 3 inches, never letting the heat accumulate in one area, always pausing between stitches to feel the metal with the back of his finger, confirming that it was cool enough for the next touch. The interior of the mold, with its 12 tubes standing in tight array, made the work slightly awkward because the soldering iron had to be angled carefully to avoid touching a tube or leaving a stray smear of solder on the tray surface. The tinsmith held the iron at a low slant, almost horizontal, and his wrist turned with the slow, controlled grace of a painter adding fine details to a canvas. Each stitch joined the tray to the wall with a neat, silvery dot, and the dots accumulated around the perimeter like the studs on a belt, forming a broken line that was strong yet flexible, allowing the metal to expand and contract with temperature changes without cracking. Once all the stitches were in place and fully cooled, the tinsmith inspected the assembly by lifting the entire mold and turning it gently in his hands, peering inside to see the tray from below. The tubes, now secured at both top and bottom, no longer wobbled or clinked. They were as rigid as if they had grown from the tin itself. The wick-holder discs at their bases sat flat and true on the bottom plate, and the upper rims of the tubes protruded through the tray by exactly the same amount, forming a level plane that would make it easy for a settler to pour melted tallow evenly into all 12 cavities at once. The alignment was so precise that a straight edge laid across the tube tops touched every one of them without rocking, and the tinsmith nodded his small private nod at this confirmation. A small amount of flux residue had collected around the base of each solder stitch, flaky and amber brown, and the tinsmith cleaned it away with a slim wooden pick that he had whittled from a scrap of hickory. The pick's point was sharp enough to dislodge the hardened rosin without scratching the tin, and he worked it gently around each bead, flicking the flakes into the scrap basket with a soft, regular motion. The tubes were wiped inside and out with a clean, dry rag to remove any dust or rosin particles that might have drifted onto them during soldering, and the whole assembly was given a final visual check, the tinsmith's eyes moving slowly from corner to corner, seam to seam, tube to tube, in a complete circuit that left no detail unobserved. The mold now possessed its full interior structure, a rectangular tin box divided into 12 identical vertical chambers, each one destined to shape a candle that would burn in some far-off cabin's darkness. The thought of that distant cabin, its hearth and its windows and its long prairie nights, did not enter the workshop with any fanfare. It hovered at the edge of awareness like a half-remembered dream, present but not demanding. The tinsmith set the completed mold body with its neat forest of tubes on the center of the bench, and the late afternoon sun, now distinctly amber in its tone, fell across it in a warm, level beam that made the tin glow as if lit from within. The shadows of the tubes stretched diagonally across the bottom plate in a series of long grey stripes, and for a moment the mould looked less like a tool and more like a small, precise model of a temple courtyard, its columns standing in silent, orderly rows. The workshop had grown quieter as the afternoon progressed, the birds outside having retreated from the heat, the breeze having dropped to a near stillness that left the elm leaves hanging motionless against the sky. The tinsmith wiped his hands on his apron, took another sip of water, and allowed himself a brief, seated moment on the low stool near the window, his back resting against the wall-boards that were warm from the sun. His gaze travelled across the bench, across the mould, across the tools waiting on their pegs, and there was no urgency in his expression, only the calm of a person who has moved through a day in steady, measured steps. The mould was almost finished. Only the lid and its hinges remained, and those would be fitted in the next chapter of the work, when the sun was a little lower and the shadows a little longer, in that gentle, declining part of the afternoon that turns all tasks into a quiet preparation for evening. The lid that would close the candle mould was not yet a lid, but merely another flat sheet of tin plate, selected from the stack against the wall and measured twice with the boxwood rule before any mark was made. The tinsmith had taken this sheet from the middle of the pile, where the metal was least likely to have picked up any warp from leaning, and he laid it on the bench with the spangled side facing up so the light could show any hidden waves or dents. There were none, only the familiar clouded gleam of good tin plate. And so the measurements began. The rule laid along one edge and then the other, the dimensions transferred with a scratch awl whose point whispered across the surface in a series of fine, silver lines. The lid would need to be slightly larger than the mould's opening, larger by exactly 3/8 of an inch on each side, so that when it rested on top it would create a modest overhang, like the brim of a hat shading a face, protecting the candle tubes inside from the dust and chaff that would inevitably sift through a wagon's covering on the long journey west. The scribed lines marked out a rectangle 9 3/4 inches long by 4 3/4 inches wide, and at each corner the tinsmith drew a small curved radius using a thin tin disc as a guide, its edge traced with the awl to soften what would otherwise be sharp, square points. These rounded corners served no mechanical purpose. They were simply more pleasant to the eye and less likely to catch on a sleeve or a packing cloth, a small grace note added without fanfare. When the scribing was complete, the tinsmith lifted the sheet and positioned it so the first cut line overhung the bench edge by a finger's width, and then the shears were taken up, their curved blades closing with that same gentle, rolling snip that had become the day's constant, reassuring sound. The waste material fell away in a long, curling strip that tried to spiral, but was too wide to hold its shape, collapsing instead into a loose, silvery loop that the tinsmith dropped into the scrap basket without looking away from the work. After the cutting came the filing, the fine-toothed file drawn along each edge of the lid in smooth, steady strokes that removed the burr and left behind a clean, slightly rounded border that was soft to the touch. The tinsmith paid particular attention to the rounded corners, using a half-round file for those curves, the tool rocking gently in his hand as it followed the arc, its teeth making a slightly different sound on the curve, a shushing that rose and fell in pitch as the radius came and went. When all 4 edges were smooth, he laid the lid on top of the open mold body to check the fit, and the overhang was even on all sides, exactly 3/8 of an inch, a neat, proportional border that said this lid belonged to this box and to no other. A lid that merely rested on top would slide off during transport, so the next task was to attach two small hinges along one of the long edges, hinges that would allow the lid to swing open and closed with a smooth, quiet motion. The hinges were not bought from a hardware merchant, but made by the tinsmith himself from small rectangles of tinplate left over from previous projects. Each rectangle folded around a short length of iron wire to form a tubular knuckle, the two leaves of the hinge spreading outward like the wings of a tiny metallic butterfly. He selected two of these from a small wooden box on the shelf, each one already formed and ready, their knuckles bright from the wire inside, and he set them on the bench beside the lid, orienting them so their leaves pointed in the right direction. The wire that acted as the hinge pin was a slim, straight piece of iron, cut to length and filed smooth at both ends, and it would slide through the knuckles and remain there permanently, its ends bent slightly to prevent it from working loose over time. To attach the hinges, the tinsmith first positioned them on the underside of the lid, their leaves resting flat against the tin, with the knuckles aligned precisely along the back edge. He used a small steel square to confirm that the knuckles were parallel to the edge, and then he marked the screw hole positions with the point of an awl, pressing just hard enough to leave a tiny dimple in the tin. In truth, these were not screws but small tin rivets, cut from the same solder wire and flattened on both ends, and the holes were made with a fine drill bit twisted by hand in a small bow drill whose string hummed a low, breathy note as it turned. The drill bit into the tin with a faint, gritty sound, and within a few slow turns a neat round hole appeared, its edges clean and bright. 4 holes for each hinge leaf, 16 holes in all, drilled in a patient rhythm that took considerably longer than the cutting of the lid itself. The tinsmith's hand on the bow drill moved at a constant, unhurried pace, the bow travelling back and forth in short, even strokes, the drill bit advancing through the tin with a steadiness that came from knowing exactly how much pressure was enough and no more. With the holes drilled, the hinges were riveted in place. The tinsmith inserted a tiny tin rivet through each hole, its head resting on the underside of the lid, while its protruding tip waited on the hinge side, and then he tapped each tip with a small ball-peen hammer, a tool whose head was no larger than a thimble, its polished face rounding over the soft tin rivet into a smooth, mushroom-shaped cap that held the hinge leaf firmly against the lid. The tapping was a delicate percussion, a series of tiny metallic ticks that sounded like a very distant clockwork, each tap carefully controlled so that the rivet tightened without distorting the surrounding metal or cracking the hinge's thin tin leaf. When all 16 rivets were peened over, the hinges were as much a part of the lid as if they had grown there, their grey tin surfaces matching the surrounding metal in colour and lustre, their knuckles projecting just slightly beyond the lid's back edge, 2 neat cylindrical bumps that would accept the wire hinge pin. The next step was to attach the free leaves of the hinges to the mould body itself. This required aligning the lid on the box with the overhang even all around, and then marking the corresponding hole positions on the back wall of the mould. The tinsmith held the lid in position with one hand, while he used the awl with the other, reaching inside the box to mark the hole locations from beneath. A slightly awkward maneuver that he performed with the slow, careful precision of long practice. The holes were drilled through the back wall of the mould body, the bow drill humming its low, breathy note again, and then the rivets were inserted and peened over from the inside, their heads forming a neat row of tiny silver dots against the inner wall. When the hinge pin wire was slid through the aligned knuckles, its ends bent into small, neat hooks that would never catch on anything, the lid was officially attached, and it swung open with a motion so smooth and silent that it felt almost weightless, the 2 hinges working in perfect, frictionless concert. The lid opened to slightly more than 90 degrees, enough to stand on its own without falling backward, and when it closed, the overhang seated itself neatly over the front and side walls with a soft, definite sensation that transmitted through the fingers as a tiny, satisfying click. That click was not an audible sound so much as a felt one, a gentle, low-frequency confirmation that the lid had met the rim and was now resting in its proper place. The tinsmith opened the lid and closed it several times, not out of play but out of checking, his eyes watching the gap between lid and rim, his fingers feeling the hinge action for any catch or roughness. There was none. The hinges worked as they had been made to work, and the lid seemed almost to float into position, guided by the alignment that had been established hole by hole, rivet by rivet, in a slow accumulation of tiny, precise decisions. A lid that could open also needed a way to stay closed, particularly on the bed of a jolting wagon where every bump and rut would try to flip it open and spill the precious candle tubes into the straw. For this purpose, the tinsmith fashioned a simple wire catch, a length of thin iron wire that he bent with a pair of round-nosed pliers into a shape like a flattened S, one loop of the S forming a springy hook that would engage a small staple on the front wall, the other loop forming a finger tab that would allow the catch to be lifted. The staple was made from the same wire, bent into a U and driven into two tiny holes drilled through the front wall of the mold body, its legs pinned over on the inside to hold it fast. The catch was riveted to the center of the lid's front edge, and when the lid was closed and the hook engaged the staple, it held with a gentle, springy tension that would resist any casual attempt to open but would yield easily to a deliberate lift of the finger tab. The tinsmith tested this catch many times, opening and closing, feeling the spring tension, adjusting the bend of the wire by minute degrees until the action was both secure and easy, a small tactile satisfaction that rounded out the mold's lid assembly. With the lid hinged and the catch fitted, the mold was structurally complete, but its surface still carried the faint smudges and marks of a long day's handling. The tinsmith turned now to the finishing, a stage of the work that was quieter still than the cutting and soldering, a stage that seemed to belong to the approaching evening rather than the busy middle of the day. He took a soft, worn rag from the shelf and a small clay jar of fine pumice powder, the powder so pale it was almost white, ground from volcanic stone and as fine as milled flour. Dipping the rag into the powder, he began to rub the exterior of the mold in slow, circular motions, the rag moving across the tin surfaces with a light, even pressure that gradually brightened the metal, removing the dull grey oxide and revealing a soft, silvery luster beneath. The sound of this polishing was a continuous, gentle shh, like the sound of a calm sea heard from a great distance, and the motion was deeply repetitive, the circles overlapping, the rag turning in the hand, the pumice powder gradually darkening as it picked up the microscopic particles of oxidation. Each face of the mold received this attention, the front and the back, the two ends, the lid, top and its underside, and then the interior tray and the upper rims of the 12 tubes reached with a smaller rag wrapped around a finger, the fingertip tracing the inner circles with a slow, patient rotation. The flux stains that had resisted the damp rag earlier dissolved under the mild abrasive action of the pumice, and the solder seams, which had been slightly duller than the surrounding tin, brightened until they were nearly indistinguishable from the parent metal, their silver lines blending into a unified, even surface. The mold began to glow with a modest, understated sheen, not shiny like a mirror, but softly lustrous like the belly of a cloud, a finish that was as practical as it was pleasant, for a polished surface would resist rust better than a rough one and would be easier to clean after each candle-making session in a smoky, distant kitchen. The polishing rag made its final slow circuit of the mold, and then the tinsmith set it down and took a step back, brushing a stray wisp of pumice dust from his apron. The completed mold sat on the bench in the now golden light of late afternoon, its lid closed, its catch engaged, its 12 interior tubes hidden but known, its surfaces carrying the quiet glow of careful work brought to a proper conclusion. The shadows in the workshop had grown long and slanted, stretching from the legs of the bench to the base of the wall, and the air had cooled just slightly, enough to notice, enough to remind the body that evening was not far off. The tinsmith picked up the mold and turned it once in his hands, feeling its weight and its solidity, and then he set it down gently on the corner of the bench where the other completed molds waited. A small family of identical tin boxes, each one destined for a different wagon, a different journey, a different patch of darkness waiting to be filled with steady, dependable candlelight. The stamp that would leave the maker's mark on the finished candle mold was a small tool of forged steel, its face no larger than a thumbnail, and it lived in a shallow drawer of the bench wrapped in a square of oiled cloth to keep the rust away. The tinsmith retrieved it now, unfolding the cloth with the same slow care he gave to every object in the workshop, and held the stamp up to the window light to inspect its face. The design was simple, an oval line enclosing the initials J.S., and beneath them the numerals 1830, all cut in reverse so that when the stamp struck the tin, the impression would read correctly. Years of use had polished the steel face to a dark, mirror-like gleam, and the letters stood out as tiny, squared valleys that had stamped their mark into hundreds of tin objects sent out into the world, oil funnels and lanterns and candle molds, each one carrying this quiet signature to places the tinsmith would never see. He rubbed the face once with a soft cloth, not because it needed cleaning, but because the gesture was part of the rhythm of preparation. And then he set the stamp on the bench beside the completed mold, aligning it with the bottom plate where the mark would go. The placement of the mark was never random. The tinsmith had long ago decided that the bottom of the mold was the only proper surface, for it was flat and protected, and would not be worn away by handling or by the heat of candle making. The mark would be hidden most of the time, visible only when the mold was lifted or turned over, and this was as it should be, for the mark was not an advertisement, but a record. A small permanent note that this object had passed through a particular pair of hands on a particular year in a small Connecticut workshop. The tinsmith turned the mold upside down on the bench, the lid facing downward and the bottom plate facing up, its surface clean and bright from the pumice polishing. He chose a spot near one corner, leaving room for the mark to breathe, and then he took up a stamp and a small hammer whose head was flat and polished. The hammer not much larger than a tack hammer, but heavier in its iron, solid and compact. Stamping tin plate required a particular touch, for the metal was thin and would dent if struck too hard, while too soft a blow would leave a faint, incomplete impression that would wear away with time. The tinsmith held the stamp upright between thumb and forefinger, its oval face resting flat against the bottom plate in the chosen spot, and he tilted it slightly to one side to ensure the edge would bite into the tin evenly. The hammer was lifted no more than 3 inches above the stamp's head, and then it descended in a single, sharp stroke. Not a heavy blow, but a brisk, precise tap that sent a clear, metallic tink through the quiet workshop air. The sound was brief and bright, like the call of a small bell, and it died away instantly, leaving behind a crisp, neat impression in the tin. The tinsmith lifted the stamp and inspected the mark, turning the mold so the light raked across the oval. The initials were clear, the numerals sharp, the depth uniform, and there was no distortion of the surrounding metal. It was a good mark, clean and permanent. With the mark stamped, the mold was ready to be wrapped for its journey. The wrapping materials were kept on a shelf near the back of the workshop, a stack of brown-oiled paper sheets and a spool of cotton twine, along with a small wooden crate that had been assembled the day before from planed pine boards and fastened with iron nails. The tinsmith brought these to the bench and laid out a single sheet of the oiled paper, its surface slightly translucent and smelling faintly of linseed, a smell that mingled with the pine and tin in the air, adding another layer to the workshop's quiet atmosphere. The paper was cut to a generous size, large enough to wrap around the mold completely, with a double layer on the ends where the corners might poke through. The oil in the paper had been applied by the papermaker, not soaked, but brushed on in a thin coat that made the paper water-resistant without making it greasy to the touch, and it crinkled with a low, soft rustle when handled, a sound like dry leaves stirred by a gentle foot. The tinsmith placed the mold in the center of the paper, orienting it so the long sides ran across the paper's grain, which would make the folding easier. He lifted one long edge of the paper and folded it over the mold, smoothing it down with the flat of his palm, the paper conforming to the rectangular shape with a willing, gentle compliance. Then the other long edge came over, overlapping the first by a generous inch, and the tinsmith pressed the seam flat with his thumb, working from one end to the other to ensure no air pockets were trapped beneath. The end flaps were folded next, a sequence of triangular folds that the tinsmith performed with the automatic ease of long practice. Each fold, crisp and tidy, the paper tucked snugly against the mold's short sides like the corners of a neatly made bed. The wrapped mold now looked like a simple brown parcel, anonymous and secure, giving no hint of the 12 silver tubes waiting inside. The cotton twine came next, fed from the large spool that hung on a wooden peg beside the shelf. The twine was undyed, a soft, pale cream color, and it had a slight fuzziness that gave it a good grip against the oiled paper. The tinsmith cut a length about 3 feet long and centered it under the wrapped mold, then brought both ends up and crossed them on top, pulling them snug but not tight enough to crush the paper. He tied a simple square knot, the kind that would hold against vibration but could be untied with a single pull of the loose end, and then he cut another length of twine and tied it across the short direction, creating a cross pattern that would keep the paper from shifting or unwrapping if it got jostled. The knots were neat and small, their loops lying flat against the paper, and the tinsmith tested each one with a gentle tug, nodding as they held firm. The parcel was now ready for the crate, its brown paper and pale twine giving it the look of a small, important package destined for a long road. The wooden crate that would carry the batch of molds was a simple box made from pine boards half an inch thick, its corners joined with small iron nails that had been driven and clenched. It was about the size of a traveling trunk, deep enough to hold 2 layers of wrapped molds separated by a thick pad of straw, and its lid was not yet nailed down but rested loosely on top, waiting to be filled. The tinsmith carried the crate to the bench, its weight still light, and opened the lid, setting it aside against the wall. Inside, a bed of clean straw had already been spread across the bottom, the straw golden and dry, smelling of a summer meadow long gone, its hollow stems making a soft, rustling whisper as they settled. The tinsmith smoothed the straw with his palm, creating an even layer about 2 inches deep, and then he lifted the first wrapped mold and laid it gently into the straw, pressing it down just enough to create a shallow nest. The second wrapped mold went in beside it, then the third, each one settled into its own depression so they would not rub against each other. When the first layer was complete, the tinsmith added more straw, this time handful by handful, tucking it around and between the parcels with the patience of someone who had packed many crates and knew that straw was the difference between a mold arriving dented or arriving sound. The straw needed to be dense enough to hold the parcels still, but not so dense that it would transmit every bump of the wagon wheels. He pressed it down with the flat of his hands, feeling for any hollow spots, and when the layer was compact and even, he laid a sheet of brown paper over it, creating a smooth platform for the second layer of molds. The process repeated, 3 more wrapped parcels placed in their straw nests, more straw tucked and pressed around them, and then a final sheet of paper on top before the lid was fitted. The lid of the crate was fastened with 6 small iron nails, driven one by one with the same small hammer that had stamped the maker's mark. Each nail was held between thumb and forefinger, its point pressed into the pine until it stood upright on its own, and then the hammer tapped it home with 3 or 4 light ringing strokes, the sound of each tap clear and musical in the quiet workshop. By the time all 6 nails were driven, their heads sat flush with the wood, and the crate was sealed, its contents hidden and protected, ready to be carried to the cart that would take it to the merchant in Albany. The tinsmith ran his hand over the lid, feeling for any nail that might be standing proud, and finding none, he set the hammer back in its place on the wall and brushed the stray bits of straw from his apron. There was a second crate waiting on the floor near the door, already packed and sealed earlier in the week, its pine board slightly paler than the one just finished, its label painted in simple black letters reading, Albany, Tinware, handle with care. The new crate would join it tomorrow, and together the two would travel down the cart path to the town road, and from there a wagon would carry them to the river, where a flatboat or a small sloop would take them up the Hudson toward the bustling docks where westward-bound families bartered for supplies. The tinsmith did not dwell on this journey. He knew it would happen as it always happened, the crates moving from hand to hand, the molds inside remaining still and patient within their wrapping, until one day a woman in a sunbonnet or a man in a dusty coat would open the paper and lift out the tin box, feeling its sturdy weight and seeing the maker's mark, and then the mold would begin its true work, transforming tallow and beeswax into rows of steady burning candles. The afternoon had grown late while the wrapping and packing progressed, and the light through the window had deepened to a rich amber gold that painted long, slanting rectangles across the floorboards and made the dust motes sparkle like drifting sparks. The workshop felt hushed and complete, the main work of the day now finished. The tools mostly returned to their pegs, the bench cleared of all but the few items that would be needed again tomorrow. The tinsmith took up the small brush that lived in a cup near the window and swept the bench clean, the short bristles gathering up the last of the tin dust and the bits of straw and the tiny flakes of flux that had accumulated since morning, tipping them all into the scrap basket that was now nearly full and would need to be emptied soon. He wiped the bench with a damp rag, removing the faint greasy traces of the oiled paper, and then he stood for a moment with his hands resting on the smooth, clean wood, looking out the window at the sky that was just beginning to show the first pale hint of evening color. A wash of rose and gold above the distant tree line. The stamped mark, hidden now beneath oiled paper and cotton twine and a nesting of straw, would stay invisible until the mold reached its final home. But the tinsmith knew it was there, and that knowledge was a quiet, private satisfaction that asked for no recognition. He picked up the oiled cloth that had wrapped the stamp and folded it carefully around the small steel tool, tucking the edges under just so, and returned it to the drawer where it would wait for the next mold in the batch, the next chance to press a small oval of identity into a blank sheet of tin. The drawer slid closed with a soft wooden thump, and the workshop settled into a deeper stillness, the kind of stillness that comes at the end of a productive day when every task has been finished in its proper order and nothing has been left undone or rushed. Outside, a single bird called once, a long, liquid note that hung in the cooling air, and then the silence returned, full and peaceful, as the light continued its slow, imperceptible fade toward dusk. The evening light came into the workshop not as a sudden change, but as a gradual softening, a slow shift from the golden amber of late afternoon into a cooler, grayer tone that seemed to rise from the floorboards and climb the walls. The sun had dropped below the tree line, and though the sky above the elms still held a wash of pale rose and lemon, the window now admitted only a diffuse, shadowless glow that made the tools on their pegs look softer and the corners of the room deeper. The air, which had been warm and still for most of the afternoon, began to stir with a faint, cool current that slipped through the gap under the door and carried the first hint of evening dampness, the smell of grass that was already beginning to dew, and of earth releasing its stored heat back into the sky. Inside the workshop, the day's accumulated warmth lingered in the wooden bench and the brick hearth and the iron of the soldering pot, but it was a warmth that was slowly, patiently ebbing, like a held breath being let out over many minutes. The tinsmith had finished his packing and his sweeping, and now he moved through the closing routines of the workshop with the same unhurried rhythm that had carried him through every other part of the day. The soldering pot on its brick hearth had been the center of heat for hours, but the coals beneath it were now mostly spent. Their orange glow faded to a soft, pulsing grey that was barely visible through the ash. He took up the long-handled tongs and opened the small firebox door, and with a few careful movements, he lifted out the largest remaining coals one by one and carried them to the outside brazier where they could burn out safely in the open air. Each coal, as it was lifted, gave off a tiny shower of sparks that spiraled upward and died before they reached the tinsmith's sleeve. And in the growing dimness, those sparks were like very brief, very small fireflies, there and then gone, leaving only the memory of their brightness. The ash that remained in the firebox was soft and white and deep, and he scooped it out with a small iron shovel and emptied it into the ash bucket that stood by the back door, the same bucket that would be spread on the garden soil tomorrow morning. With the firebox empty and its door left open to cool, the soldering pot began to give up its stored heat to the air. The pool of solder inside had been allowed to solidify naturally, cooling over the past hour from bright liquid to a sluggish, porridge-like state, and then to a solid, pewter-colored mass whose surface was wrinkled with the memory of its last stir. The tinsmith laid a thin sheet of tin across the top of the pot to keep dust from settling in the soda overnight, a simple lid that he had cut for this purpose long ago, and he left the pot where it stood, for it was never moved. The brick hearth was still warm to the touch, and it would remain warm for another hour or more, radiating its last heat into the workshop like a stone that had basked all day in the sun. The copper soldering iron, which had spent the day being lifted and reheated and lifted again, was now cool enough to handle without gloves. The tinsmith wiped its tip with a rag that had been dipped in a thin oil, working the oil into the tin's surface to prevent rust from forming overnight. A thin, protective film that would be burned off in the first moments of tomorrow's work. The iron was then hung on its special hook on the wall, a hook that was set apart from the others because the iron was long and needed clearance, and it swung there gently, its wooden handle dark with use, its copper head now a dull, dark brown rather than the glowing red of midday. The sile ammoniac block was covered with a small tin cup that fit over it exactly, keeping the moisture of the night air from turning the white crystals to a sticky paste, and the flux pot was sealed with its lid screwed down tight, the brush still damp inside, resting across the rim. The tools on the bench were put away in a specific order that the tinsmith had followed for so many years. It felt less like a task and more like a natural unfurling. The tin shears were closed, their blades pressed together with a soft, oiled click, and laid flat in their drawer. The rawhide mallet was hung on its peg, the stamp was wrapped in its oiled cloth and tucked into its place. The boxwood rule was wiped and set back on its ledge. The scribing awl returned to its leather cup. Each tool seemed to settle into its spot with a small sigh of arrival, and the wall of the workshop, which in full daylight had been a busy array of shapes and handles, became a quiet arrangement of shadows and profiles, each peg occupied, each surface clear. The bench itself, now entirely empty, showed the full extent of its patina. The years of sliding metal and resting tools and patient hands that had worn the wood into a landscape of shallow, gentle contours. The tinsmith moved to the window and stood for a moment looking out at the landscape that had been his companion through the day. The sky had deepened to a soft slate blue, and the first few stars were beginning to appear, tiny points of silver that were almost not there, so faint they might have been imagined. The elm tree was a dark silhouette against the fading light, its branches still and graceful, and beyond it the fields stretched away into a low mist that was beginning to form in the hollows, a thin, white vapor that lay along the ground like a blanket, being slowly drawn up. The cart path was empty, the shed a dark shape, the distant chimney smoke of neighboring farms now invisible against the evening sky. Nothing moved out there except a single bat that flickered across the high air in a zigzag path, its flight silent and erratic, a punctuation of motion in the general stillness. The tinsmith watched the bat for a moment, then reached up and pulled the wooden shutter closed, lifting it from the outside sill and drawing it inward until it met the frame with a soft, hollow thump that sealed the workshop from the night. With the shutter closed, the room was lit only by the single oil lamp that had been turned down low, its flame no larger than a bean, casting a small, unsteady circle of yellow light on the corner of the bench. The shadows in the room gathered thickly now, pooling under the bench and behind the stove and in the far corners where the lamp's reach could not penetrate. The walls, which had been a warm honey color in the afternoon, were now a deep, muted brown, and the tools on their pegs were reduced to a series of dark vertical strokes against the darker wood. The atmosphere was not gloomy but peaceful, a kind of visual quiet that matched the silence of the countryside outside, and the air was cool enough now that you might want to cross your arms over your chest if you were standing still, though the tinsmith seemed not to notice the temperature change at all. The small clay pitcher that had held the day's water was nearly empty, and the tinsmith poured the last of it into the basin, where it made a brief hollow sound before settling into silence. He washed his hands for the evening, scrubbing them slowly with the plain soap, working the lather around his fingers and over his knuckles and into the creases of his palms, rinsing away the last traces of tin dust and flux and pumice that the day had left behind. The water in the basin had grown quite cloudy, a pale grey soup that carried small flecks of metal and rosin, and when he was finished, he lifted the basin and carried it to the back door, pouring it out onto the grass where the water spread in a dark, momentary stain, and then soaked into the earth. The basin was wiped dry with the cloth that hung on its peg, the cloth itself now damp and grey, and it was left hanging to dry overnight, ready for the next morning's washing. The tinsmith then did a small thing that might have gone unnoticed by anyone watching. He walked to the corner of the bench where the two crates stood, the one he had packed today and the one packed earlier in the week, and he rested his palm flat on the top of each in turn. A light, brief touch that might have been a farewell or a blessing, or simply a habit with no particular meaning. The pine boards were cool and smooth under his hand, the iron nail heads slightly rough, and the paper labels that read Albany, tinware, handle with care, were just visible in the lamplight as pale rectangles against the wood. The crates held 6 candle molds between them, 6 tools for making light that would travel further than the tinsmith himself had ever traveled, across the Hudson River and up the Mohawk Valley and along the rutted roads that led to the lake country and the prairie beyond, where families were even now building cabins and breaking sod and preparing for their first winter in a new land. The thought was not a large one. It was simply there, like a distant landmark seen from a high place, present but not demanding attention. The lamp's wick was trimmed one final time, the small brass scissors snipping off the charred tip which fell onto the tin tray with a tiny black curl of smoke. The oil level in the reservoir was checked by lifting the glass chimney and dipping a thin wire, and there was enough to last through the small hours of any task that might require light in the night, though the tinsmith knew no such task would come. With everything in its place, he stood beside the bench and looked slowly around the workshop, his gaze passing over the tool rack and the scrap basket and the coal stove and the crates and the long, empty bench top. A sweeping, deliberate survey that was not a search for anything forgotten, but a quiet acknowledgement of a day fully lived. The workshop, in the low lamplight, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final act that would signal the true end of the working hours. That final act was the extinguishing of the lamp. The tinsmith lifted the small brass lever that controlled the wick and turned it slowly downward, and the flame shrank in response, becoming first a tiny blue bead, then a mere spark of yellow, and then nothing at all, disappearing with a faint, final wisp of smoke that smelled briefly of hot oil and cotton, and then faded into the general cool darkness of the room. The smell of the extinguished lamp, which was the smell of a day ending all through that century in workshops and farmhouses and parlors, lingered for a few heartbeats, and then was gone, leaving only the cool, familiar sense of tin and pine and old wood and clean air, the permanent atmosphere of the workshop that no amount of daylight or firelight could ever fully displace. In the darkness, the workshop settled into a profound stillness that was deeper even than the quiet of the early morning. The floorboards, which had creaked occasionally under the day's slow footsteps, were now silent and motionless. The tools on the wall, which had been lifted and used and returned, rested in their places without any need to be touched again. The soldering pot on its hearth gave up its last residual heat to the air in a slow, invisible exhalation, its temperature dropping degree by degree toward the coolness of the night. The candle mold, wrapped in its oiled paper and nestled in its straw, lay in perfect darkness inside its crate, its 12 silver tubes pointing upward toward the lid, its maker's mark hidden beneath the twine and paper, waiting for the hands that would someday unwrap it and fill it with tallow and set it over a pot of steaming water in a cabin kitchen 1,000 miles away. Outside, beyond the closed shutter, the night had fully arrived. The stars, which had been faint specks when the tinsmith last looked out, were now a dense glittering spray across the black dome of the sky. The Milky Way, a faint cloudy river of light that ran from horizon to horizon. The mist in the hollows had thickened into a low white fog that covered the fields like a second earth, and in the woods a single owl called once, a low, soft whoo that travelled across the damp air and reached the workshop as a sound so muffled it might have been only a memory of a sound. The elm tree stood as a deeper darkness against the starfield, its branches unmoving, its new spring leaves folded and still. No wagon creaked on the road, no horse whinnied in the distance, no rooster made its premature call. The entire countryside, from the workshop to the distant river and beyond, was wrapped in the deep, restful silence that comes only in the middle of the night, when all labor has ceased and all creatures have found their rest. Inside the workshop, the darkness was not an empty darkness but a populated one, filled with the presence of all the objects that had been part of the day's story. The crates stood by the door, solid and patient, their pine boards slowly acclimating to the cooler air. The bench stretched its long, empty surface toward the window, its patina invisible but still there, its history inscribed in the wood grain. The scrap basket beneath it held the curled shavings and cut corners and twisted spirals of tin that had been removed from the sheets, each one a negative space of the finished mold, a record of what had been taken away to reveal the useful shape. The tools hung in their silent order, the mallets and the shears and the files and the mandrels, each one a particular answer to a particular need, each one ready to be lifted again when the morning came. And in the corner, the small pot-bellied stove, cold and dark and empty of fire, waited through the night with the patience of iron, knowing that no one would ask it for warmth until the autumn returned. The tinsmith, who had paused for a long moment in the center of the workshop after extinguishing the lamp, now moved toward the door. His footsteps on the floorboards were slow and soft. His hand found the iron latch in the darkness by touch alone, and the door opened with a quiet, low sound onto the cool, damp air of the spring night. He stepped outside, and the door was pulled closed behind him, its latch falling into place with a gentle, definite click that marked the end of the working day. The workshop was left alone in the darkness, a small rectangle of stillness among the fields and woods, holding within its walls the scent of tin and the memory of patient labor, and the 6 wrapped candle molds that would soon begin their journey westward, toward homes not yet built, toward families not yet known, toward the long, quiet winters of a new country where the simple light of a tallow candle would mean warmth and safety and the promise of another day. And as the night deepened and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, the workshop remained perfectly still, its silence undisturbed by any sound except perhaps the tiny microscopic settling of the tinplate pieces in their straw nests, a movement so small no ear could ever hear it, the candle molds resting in the darkness as they would rest through the nights of their long journey, waiting to be filled with wax and wicked with cotton and lit against the darkness they were made to transform.